Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, everybody can hear me. My name is Kellyanne Boyce, and I proudly serve as president of the Chautauqua Women's Club. Welcome to our Contemporary Issues Forum, or CIF for short. We gather here every Saturday afternoon at 3 p.m. through August 22nd. And whether this is your first lecture or you're one of our many returning friends, we are so glad you're here. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the hardworking people who make the afternoons possible. Thank you to Jake, who faithfully records each lecture for us. Thank you to Deb Treffs for yet another wonderful article in today's Chautauquan Daily. Thank you to Jean, our usher, and thank you to Hope and Margaret over there. Margaret's from the bookstore, and Hope is the glue that keeps Chautauqua Women's Club together. So after you can see them after the lecture, there will be a book signing immediately following the Q&A today. So thank you to all. We are so deeply grateful to our 2026 CIF sponsors: Anonymous Donor, Chrissy Fulton and George Fector, Lauren Rich Fine of Beatrice Advisors, Susan O'Connor Baird, McGee Women's Research Institute, and Kathy Bonner, Mary Lou Goodman, and Josette Raleigh, in loving memory of Rita Arjun Auerbach. Your generosity truly helps us make these lectures possible, so thank you. So for 137 years, the Chautauqua Women's Club has brought people together through curiosity, through learning, through friendship, and community. We exist to inspire and empower women, and yes, the men that love them. Today, we have more than 900 members, and including over 100 men. We are grateful for every one of them, so thank you. This summer, we also celebrated one of our proudest milestones in our history. With our most recent gift to Chautauqua Institution, the Women's Club has now provided more than $2 million in scholarships over 42 consecutive years. Every scholarship represents a young artist, musician, performer, or student whose life has been changed because of generation of CWC members who believed in investing in the future. So thank you for helping us all carry that legacy forward. If you'd like to learn more about membership or our year-round Chautauqua Academy programs, please stop by the welcome table on your way out or visit chautauquawomensclub.org. Now on to today's speaker. One of the things I treasure the most about Chautauqua is that we do bring people together from every generation. We come with different experiences, different perspectives, different family stories, and somehow for each hour, every Saturday, we sit side by side and we learn from one another. Today's speaker reminds us that some of our greatest understanding doesn't come from having all the answers. Sometimes it comes through stories. Sarai Johnson is an award-winning novelist, writing educator, professor at Howard University, and her remarkable debut novel, Grown Women, was named one of the best books of 2024 by The New Yorker, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Chicago Public Library, and the Griot. It went on to earn both the 2025 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work by a debut author, and the Hurston Wright Foundation's Zora Award for Debut Fiction, which I know meant so much to Sarah. But what makes Sarah's work so compelling isn't simply the awards, it's her willingness to explore the complicated spaces between mothers and daughters, between generations, between hurt and healing. In today's talk, Grown Women, Intergenerational Healing Through Fiction, she'll share how reading and writing helped her better understand her own family and how her storytelling can become a bridge towards empathy, forgiveness, and deeper human connection. This is Sarah's first time at Chautauqua, and she is here with her lovely husband, Dennis Cordell. And thank you to Dennis's sister, who is watching their 2 kids so they could be here this weekend with us. Shout out to her. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a reason to come back next Saturday. We will welcome award-winning author Jim Rassenberger, whose newest book, A Perfect Coincidence, The Extraordinary Friendship and Astonishing Deaths of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, was published in conjunction with America's 250th anniversary. It is the remarkable story of 2 founding fathers whose friendship shaped our nation, whose rivalry tested it, and whose deaths on the very same day, July 4th, 1826, remain one of history's most extraordinary coincidences. If you like presidential history, the Revolutionary Era, or thoughtful conversations about democracy, I hope you'll join us. Today's lecture will be about 35 minutes, followed by 15 minutes or so for questions. There are 2 microphones right here. Please keep your questions concise, no Chautauqua prelude, and if you don't want to be recorded, please refrain from asking a question. Please speak into the microphone when you do ask a question so everyone can hear. So now, let's give a warm Chautauqua welcome to Sarai Johnson.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. First, I would like to say thank you to the Chautauqua Institute, to the CWC, the Chautauqua Women's Club. I would also like to thank Kelly here. She's a wonderful host. I'm really excited to be here today. Look at all of you. Wonderful. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to talk about intergenerational conflict. This is becoming a bit of a buzzword at the moment because I think it's changing. It's no longer sort of expected or the default or the standard that you'll love, honor, and obey your elders no matter what they do or say. And with this phenomenon has come the rise of a phrase, no contact. Like choosing to no longer be in contact with friends or family members for whatever reason. Like Oprah did a podcast episode on it. If you open any social media platform, you'll see people talking about having been cut off or people responding to having been cut off. It's very much happening online. But I think it's funny that we're talking about it as if it's new, that like no contact is new. My parents are of the baby boomer generation, and they were no or low contact with various members of their families. For example, when I was a child, my mom would drop one of my brothers and I at my grandfather's house, and she would bolt. She was out of there. And I don't think it was like the typical sort of, drop the kids off so you can have a few hours to yourself, because I have no memory whatsoever of my mother and grandfather ever being in the same room. And I know they didn't talk yearly even, maybe yearly, but certainly not monthly or daily or anything like that. Another example, on my father's side, I recently became connected with a cousin who is the daughter of my father's only sister. She actually died more than 20 years ago, so I never met her, and my father had not seen or spoken to her in 20 years before that. So it's not, what is that but no or low contact, I actually really don't know, because I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist. I'm a writer and therefore an observer, and what I've observed is an unwillingness or an inability to face some really, really hard feelings. So today, I'm going to share my experience with intergenerational conflict as a millennial. I am a millennial daughter and mother, and how my vocation as a writer and reader played a role in resolving it, or not, depending on how you look at it. But before I get started, I would like to acknowledge that I'm going to say some unflattering things about myself and others, but my intention is never to cause anyone hurt or shame, though some people might feel hurt or shame as a result of what I'm going to say. But my intention, and I do believe intention matters, is to share my story so that others may potentially see something in it and be able to move forward with their families and their lives, okay? And I want to specifically express gratitude to my parents who taught me two very important things that I think serve me daily. And number one is conflict can be good. It's better to face hard things than to pretend they do not exist. And number two, they taught me about sacrifice. I think I've decided to see sacrifice more so as generosity and discipline, but they showed me what it looked like all the same. And now we can really get started. So my first, and hopefully not my last novel, Grown Women, was released in 2024. It is about 4 generations of mothers and daughters. We have Evelyn, Charlotte, Corinna, and Camille, and that is the great-grandmother, grandmother, mother, and daughter, respectively. And the story opens with Charlotte's story when she is 18 years old in 1974, and she is pregnant, and she has recently fled her upper-class background and her mother as a result. And the reasons why become clear throughout the narrative, but Charlotte makes a lot of different choices from her mother, but still manages to have a strained relationship with her own daughter. And it's not really until Charlotte becomes a grandmother and her own daughter becomes a mother that things really change for this family. And it was a really, really hard book to write, and in many ways, I don't think it's the book I wanted to write. I think very, very early on, I was writing a character who was sort of bold and dynamic and made her own choices, and she felt very, very different from who I saw myself to be. And then I decided, where does she come from? She comes from the women that came before her. And I wanted to write this sweet little tidy family story, but as we know, family life is really tidy. And what was I? So I think I wanted these generations to really rally around this young woman no matter what, and that's not what happened. I started writing this family, the women in this family, and then I started writing the dynamics between the women in this family, and I realized I had a lot of work to do in my own relationship with my mother. And something that anyone will tell you about me that has known me for probably since I was a kid, that I've always really, really wanted to be a mother, though there were certainly times in my 20s that I wanted nothing less. But it was always something I wanted eventually. And as I started getting serious, we'll go more into this later, but as I started getting serious, I wanted to figure something out. And I remember going to lunch with a friend, and she asked me, when you're done writing, do you feel that you'll be ready to have children of your own? And I said, I hope so, because I'm pregnant. Just kidding, that didn't happen. Isn't fiction lovely? I just love fiction. That's why we're here. I wasn't pregnant yet, but I would be, I think, probably a few years later. But so at some point, the story became much more about who I wanted to be as a mother. I wanted to raise that bold, dynamic, and free daughter that I felt that I could not be. And what I'm really saying is this book was really hard, and I felt like I had a lot at stake. But the funny part is, I actually think I'd been writing Grown Women for much longer than I realized. And I'll tell you how that came to be. So about a year after Grown Women sold to HarperCollins, my family, which at that time consisted of myself, my husband, and my 1-year-old daughter, we moved from downtown DC, like we were on 11th Street, not far from the Capitol, and we moved to Alexandria, Virginia, which is right outside of the city. But the move was hard on me for some reason. I was really struggling, and during that move, I came across the box of mementos that I think many of us have, the things that we can't look at every day or don't want to look at every day, but we're certainly not going to throw them away. And my box was full of the typical things, photographs, One of my oldest childhood friends, she wrote me postcards when I went away to college, and I kept every single one of them. And I had, like the greeting cards from my baby shower. And this is the important part, there were lots and lots and lots and lots of journals, okay? And I've kept journals for as long as I can remember, but I hadn't opened these particular journals in many years, probably at least a decade. And I decided to crack them open, I think because I was struggling with this move. And there was a lot of the typical stuff. There was angst, there was bad poetry, there was collages, and I actually have some collages to show you. This is a bad one. And this is a better one, I think. Something just fell out, but this is not an embarrassing journal. There's some more of that, but we'll get to that. But there was something a little off about these journals too. So they were all in my handwriting. These were definitely my journals. There's no one else's that they could be. But I didn't remember some of the events or even recognize some of the names. And some of the events were written about myself in the third person. So most of the dates were around 2004, 2005, when I was 12 and 13. But sometimes I wrote the same date and time twice, or I wrote about myself in the future, and sometimes I wrote about before I was even born. And I didn't bring some of the more weird journals with me because I fear if I lost them that my reputation would be ruined. But I paraphrased an entry for you just so you know what kind of stuff was going on in there. So it's dated May 2015, but probably written in like 2004, 2005. Sarah lives alone in New York City in a beautiful 2-story loft apartment. She works as a fashion journalist for Vogue magazine and occasionally publishes poetry. She has a lot of really good friends, ! She is engaged to a handsome man. When people ask where she is from, she says Connecticut. So, I don't know. Preteens are weird, and I was probably a little weirder than average because I was homeschooled, and I'm going to also explain how that came to be because it is relevant. I actually grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, not Connecticut. I don't know why I was preoccupied with Connecticut. But when I was growing up, it was common to attend your neighborhood elementary school and then put your name in the lottery for a magnet school. And I got into a school with an emphasis on reading and writing, which should have been wonderful for me, but I can't tell you a single thing I read or wrote while I was there, but I do remember waking up at 5 a.m. to ride 2 buses across town and struggling in school for the first time in my life. And I think it was also a really, really hard time for my family as well, the depths of which I think I'm still trying to understand to this day. One of my brothers and I will sit down a few times a year to try to put the pieces together and figure out what was going on. But it had a major impact on me. I was getting into a lot of trouble, and the incident that ultimately led to my suspension and then my parents choosing to homeschool me was a letter writing campaign against a teacher, which is that's on brand for me. But this is my formal apology to Miss Whited. It's WHITTED. If you know her, let her know I'm sorry. Anyway, I use the term homeschooled here very loosely. There wasn't much of a curriculum, but I will credit my parents for allowing my interests to guide what we did. And apparently I used that time to write hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of fiction. So I was writing in these journals from various perspectives of place and time, but most often I wrote from my mother's perspective. I would write about an argument we had, both from my perspective and her perspective, so that's where some of the double entries are coming from. Sometimes this inspired sympathy, like the time she came home with like these huge bags of clearance clothes from JCPenney, and there was nothing really wrong with these clothes at all, but they weren't my style. And now I completely understand that it was such a privilege to be able to express a style, but at the time, I was not gracious about it. And so I wrote about this from her perspective, and I was able to figure out, I'm being ungrateful, especially considering my family's financial situation. But there were other entries that did not end in me understanding. For example, I did a research project on the Scottsboro boys, the 9 black teenage boys falsely accused of rape in Scottsboro, Alabama. And it was like the first time I'd heard of that incident, and I remember feeling really rattled by it because we didn't live far from Scottsboro, Alabama. But I wrote an essay by hand, and I was really proud of what I wrote, but my mother accused me of plagiarism. I remember her furiously flipping through all of the material we had on the subject, and I think the more clear that I had written it, the more angry she became. And I tried to write from her perspective, but what I wrote, it was ultimately incoherent. It didn't make sense. And to this day, I'm not sure exactly what made her so angry. I think, again, revisiting this, I think it might have been enviousness, not of my ability, but of my opportunity to learn in this way, in a way that really suited me. I noticed while I was going through these entries that there were none from the perspective of my father, who was a very present member of my family. We always lived in the same house. I did have conflict with my dad, particularly about school and what classes I should be taking. I'll never forgive him for making me take physics and calculus instead of the yearbook class, but I think I really always understood his vision for me. I did not always like his ideas, but he told me I could do whatever and be whoever I wanted. And to him, everything I did was a little bit magic. And my best explanation for not journaling about him in this way is that his love for me felt uncomplicated in ways that my mother's did not. And I think because of my relationship with my father, I knew something was not quite right with my relationship with my mother. And I was attempting to figure it out the only way I knew how, which was by writing. And this was a time in my life that I wouldn't have admitted to writing fiction because I wanted to be a journalist, a serious journalist. I told anybody who would listen, even those who wouldn't, that I wanted to be a serious journalist. But there's no way to describe what I was doing as anything other than fiction. But I didn't learn to do this on my own. I learned it from reading fiction. So growing up, I was a voracious reader, and I especially loved the historical fiction diary series, Dear America. Maybe you heard of it. Where you could read you could step into the side of the life of someone affected by a major historical event like the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, being aboard the Titanic. And there was a spin-off series called The Royal Diaries. I think it was a spin-off, I'm not sure actually. But you could read the fictional entries of teenage Marie Antoinette, Cleopatra, Nzinga, warrior queen of Matamba. And here I'll mention that there is a concept often used in children's literature called mirrors and windows. And mirrors are basically, they reflect our experiences back to us, and windows allow us to see into the lives of others. And effectively, I was looking through windows, and I was very, very happy to be doing that. It seems like, in fact, I was writing in my journal as if I was looking through someone else's window. And I did not have any expectation that I would experience windows or mirrors at this point. But then I came across The Skin I'm In by Sharon G. Flake. So the primary premise of this story is a dark-skinned Black girl coping with colorism in her community. But that actually isn't what had the greatest impact on me. The main character, Malika, is 13 or 14 years old, and she's given an assignment to write from the perspective of someone very, very different from her, an enslaved person in the 17th century. And at times, Malika finds ways to write about herself through this alternate lens. At other times, she is granted clarity about her own situation by writing about someone else's. And The Skin I'm In ultimately changed the way I write and read. I became very invested in perspective, and I believe it's the skin I'm in that prompted me to start writing from the perspective of others that I did not understand. Now, eventually, I would leave the young adult section and start reading books I had no business with, like Valley of the Dolls and How Stella Got Her Groove Back. And at the same time, I'm journaling furiously. But I would say easy 50 to 75% of what I wrote was not true. I wrote about trips I did not take. I wrote poems about boys who did not exist. I described outfits I never wore. But the majority of my fiction was about my mother. And it is really excruciating to read. I was often unkind and unfair to my mother, but I realized that I was really, really unkind and unfair to myself. I was going to include some entries, but there are limits to vulnerability. It was just really painful to revisit the ways in which my mother sometimes made me feel. When I wrote from her perspective, she saw me as inherently flawed. I was not good enough. I didn't work hard enough. I wasn't pretty enough. I wasn't this or that enough. And I never would be. That's how I perceived my mother's perception of me. And that's a shame. But it seems that around 2006, I started to leave my mother's perspective behind, and I became focused on my own. And this is when I started high school and returned to public school. And it seems that I was much more interested in reading than writing. And by chance, I came upon the 1949 novel, The Street by Ann Petrie. And I was attracted to it because the edition I found had like the black and white image of like the bottom half of two people. And it's a little boy and a woman, and she's wearing like a cute skirt and high heels. And I thought she was very glamorous. And I was attracted to that because there was not much glamour in my life. By that time, we had moved south of Nashville to a developing town called Spring Hill, which was at one time home to, I think, the last Saturn automotive plant. But at this time, it was becoming hit by the financial crisis, and it was like unfinished subdivisions. There was an alpaca farm, and there were wild turkeys. And that was basically all that was, but which was quite different from The Street. The Street is about a black single mom in 1940s Harlem. The main character, Ludi, works as a maid for a white family to provide for herself and her 8-year-old son, Bub. As one could imagine, Ludi is under immense pressure, but I also saw a profound loneliness in her. And this is something that Toni Morrison calls invisible ink. There's an essay in The Source of Self-Regard. It's the last essay in the collection. But she writes, the reader who is made for the book is the one attuned to the invisible ink. Invisible ink is what lies under, between, outside the lines, hidden until the right reader discovers it. And for me, the invisible ink in The Street was this loneliness. And the way that Petrie wrote about loneliness, or at least the way I interpreted it, was really profound to me. And it was ultimately when I understood that I myself was quite lonely. But it didn't end there. I read the book again and again over the years. And each time I read it, it taught me something new. It helped me understand something else. One thing was it showed me that the spaces we inhabit inform our potential. It also helped me better understand the pressure my parents were under trying to raise my siblings and I in a world that was simply not made for us. Now, as I got older, my relationship with my mother got more difficult. In college, I felt smothered by her. Her commentary and her criticism felt constant. She had a lot to say about everything I did, what I was wearing, who my friends were, how I wore my hair, anything and everything. And whatever I had been doing, that was not the right thing to be doing. And I did try to tell her how I felt, but that always ended in more sort of chaos and calamity. And in writing terms, she was not open to edits. And then came the day of my college graduation, and she had a lot to say about the length of my dress. And it was a short dress, but it was by no means indecent. But this happened in 2014, and someone just a few weeks ago mentioned to me the way that my mother talked about my skirt at my college graduation. So in general, encouragement and kindness were hard to come by with her. But I think after thinking about her perspective, I'm going to tell you some more about the things I read that helped me understand this. But she was having trouble relinquishing control of me and her place in my life. And I can empathize with that, actually. Now my daughter is going into kindergarten in just a few weeks, and it's been harder on me than I would have expected. But she's gonna be okay, she's gonna be great. But back to where we were. Interactions with her always left me drained and agitated. My boyfriend at the time, now my husband, he's right there, said that was different after I spoke to my mother, and it wasn't a positive difference. And looking back, I was also struggling with a lot of my friendships as well, because I was really, really angry and tired and agitated. But I felt obligated to have a relationship with her. That's just what you're supposed to do, right? And I remember mentioning it to people, and they would say things like, "You only get one mom," or "but she's your mother," as if that sort of excused anything she might say or do. And at the same time, this is post-graduation, I was starting to experience these really profound and meaningful mentorship relationships. And it felt very, very different from how I was feeling with my mother. And I realized I didn't really feel mothered by her. And there's a lot to be said about what it means to mother and be mothered. Like, what is a mother's responsibility? There are limits, obviously. Of course, a mother cannot meet every single one of a child's needs, right? And that's why it's a great thing we have aunts, uncles, cousins, fathers, of course. But I think we can all agree that a central tenet of being a parent is protection. And I was looking around, and I was seeing the way other mothers protected their children's emotional well-being. And I don't mean feelings. Emotional well-being and feelings are not the same thing. Emotional well-being is long-term. Feelings are short-term. And I was starting to feel that my emotional well-being needed protection. And then it was Father's Day of 2015, and I looked at my phone for the first time around 10 a.m. Mind you, I was in DC. My parents lived in Tennessee at that time, and I saw a novel of a text. It was a diatribe on how ungrateful I was for not having yet texted or called my father for Father's Day. And it was not my finest moment. We exchanged heated words, but then it dawned on me suddenly, I don't have to do this. It's not getting me anywhere. She would not accept a world in which she must accept accountability or even share accountability with me. And by this time, I'd been in therapy for a while, and I think my therapist might have suggested that I take a break from communicating with her, but I didn't listen. I'm not the greatest listener. You can ask my husband. But I finally did it. I blocked her phone number and her accounts on all social media platforms, and the peace was resplendent. At times, I no longer had to worry about, picking up my phone and hearing or reading or seeing, like a diatribe on my shortcomings or the shortcomings of others, which could be honestly just as, if not more, exhausting. And by the time I blocked her, I'd stopped trying to understand where she was coming from. I was no longer journaling as much, but when I did, I wrote only in my own voice. I decided at some point that it wasn't my job to understand why my mother behaved the way she did, if she didn't try to understand as well. And I offered chances for reconciliation, many throughout the years, and one option was go to therapy, and she chose not to go. And so while I was relieved to no longer have this sort of hanging over me, I realized what were actually very early drafts of Grown Women were so much less hopeful. It's because, in writer's terms, I had not completed my character arc in this portion of my story. I hadn't yet moved forward. But I continued reading, which is what I always do when I'm feeling lost or scared. This time I read Cora Hedora by Gail Jones, which deals intimately with the effects of generational trauma. And there's a line that comes after a matriarch reveals the source of her trauma to her daughter, and the daughter thinks to herself, and I'm paraphrasing here, "That's all well and good, but what am I going to do about my own life?" And that really resonated with me. I'd spent a lot of time working towards empathy, but I hadn't yet figured out what I was going to do as a human and as a woman. And at that time, I was working for a newspaper. Journalism was not getting me where I wanted to go, so I went back to school to get a degree in literature. And when I got there, I took a fiction workshop, and for those who don't know what a fiction workshop is, that is when you submit, everyone in the class submits a few pieces of work for the group to comment on and critique. And in this fiction workshop, everything, I remember somebody saying to me, "Why is everything you submit about mothers and daughters?" But it was starting to occur to me while I was sort of engulfed in writing at this time that writing about the past was not going to give me the answers that I needed in order to move forward. And so I started writing about the future, not the literal future, but more of an emotional future. And at this stage, I was writing Grown Women, but I did not really know that at the time. And I remember having people read what I was working on, and someone asked me, "Why don't you just write a memoir about yourself and your mother and your grandmother?" And I had to explain that I could not, because I didn't know much about that relationship. I wasn't really allowed to ask questions about that relationship, but I knew it was not good. My grandmother died when I was 10, so I did know her, but for much of that time, she was catatonic from some combination of dementia and Alzheimer's. And so I filled in the blanks with fiction. And while I filled in the blanks, I realized the silence surrounding that relationship had actually spoken volumes. There was a lot of pain there, and it would become mine if I didn't do something differently. And so Grown Women became about what it looks like to take what has happened to me and turn it into something productive. I asked myself, what does it look like to hold on to this pain and let it control my life? And what does it look like to raise children without the pain of this relationship impacting it in some way? And so I wrote about those various possibilities in Grown Women, and some of them are available for you to read, and some of them will never see the light of day. But regardless of whether you can read it or not, it was very important emotional work for me that I think is available to everyone. But I couldn't have done any of that without the aid of fiction. And when I finally figured out what I was trying to do with this book, I kept reading, and I read all kinds of things specifically related to mothers and daughters. And sometimes I was frustrated because mothers, particularly Black mothers, came across as one of two things. They were either perfect saints, as in they knew all the answers, when to say the right thing, and they were just the wonderful, perfect mother, or they were absent or had abandoned their children in some way. And my mother was neither of those things. And I was looking for mirrors, back to the mirror concept, of something that I could really relate to, or something that I could build off of or feel inspired by. And I'm not sure I ever really found that story. I'm going to quote Toni Morrison one more time. She once said, "If there's a book that you want to read but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it." So I kept reading, and I compared stories, and I wrote and rewrote because there was more work that needed to be done, both within me and within the book. And the books that helped me the most, many were fiction, and were about mothers and daughters, like White Oleander by Janet Fitch, which I'd actually read years earlier and had been much more interested in the fact that a woman kills her lover with poisonous flour in his milk. But this time, I was much more interested in the way that a daughter copes with loving a manipulative, narcissistic mother. And I read Silver Sparrow by Sarai Johnson, which helped me think critically about the impact of a mother's choices on her daughter's life. But I also read nonfiction like Mothers Who Can't Love by Susan Forward, which taught me about the various configurations of the mother wound. It helped me understand my own mother wound as well as the way it can sort of manifest in others. I read Paper Daughter by Emmeline Marr, which depicts a mother's brutality and a daughter's resilience. And also Mom and Me and Mom by Maya Angelou, which was actually kind of difficult to read at times because of the way that Angelou sort of exalts her mother. I couldn't relate to that, but I really needed to read that in order to better understand my own perspective and my own experiences. And all of these and more, there's certainly more, I had more here originally, but cut some of them out. They helped me understand the ways in which a woman's daughterhood informs her womanhood. And the more I read, the more I understood that as I entered motherhood, I had a responsibility to myself and my children to try my darndest to be a balanced and healthy person. I also realized that I was deeply, deeply privileged in a way that the women before me were not. I had agency, education, and the benefit of being born in an era that isn't perfect, but is much more amenable to women like me than it ever has. And eventually I asked myself, what do the satisfying stories have in common? Why do some of these stories feel so unsatisfying? And I noticed eventually that a lot of the mothers were only one thing. They were only mothers. And that's not fair. There were so many other things. My mother was a sister, a friend, a daughter, and I realized she was a little girl who had needed something, and it seems that she had not gotten it. But I realized there was nothing I could do for that little girl. She had been someone's responsibility, and it seemed that they had failed. When she became an adult, that hurt little girl lived on inside her, and she continued to hurt, and she hurt others as a result. And I have my own hurt little girl inside of me. She's not nearly as hurt as my mother's little girl, but she does hurt. And I don't know if she'll ever really be healed, but I know it's my responsibility and no one else's. And so I never thought that writing and publishing a book about the woes of motherhood and daughterhood would bring my mother back into my life. Because when I wrote a fiction in which it did happen, it required her to do a lot of work that she had not done. And realizing that was out of my hands, I let it be. I had no choice but to let it be. Let it be. I'll let you guess if you think my mom and I are no contact or not. Who says, am I no contact? Am I no contact with my mom? As of today, my mother and I are no contact, which is, I've made my peace with that because I feel that I've done the work and she did not return the favor. And so the ball is in her court ultimately, and I'm now a mom of 2. The book was sold when my daughter Margot was a baby, and my son was 6 weeks old when the book was released in 2024. So now more than ever, I feel that I need to protect my children by protecting myself. And my kids and I are still quite young. Maybe you've done the math. I'll be 34 this month. So I know I'll certainly make mistakes. There's certainly time to make mistakes. But I am aware of the ways in which my daughterhood shaped me. And as a result, I can make different choices. And I know those other choices may not be the right ones, but I promise to be open to edits. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm ready to take questions.
First of all, I'm familiar, not from personal, but my best friend in high school had a mother who was jealous of her, and she made a suicide attempt, my friend. And when I asked my mother what's going on with Deanna, she said her mother is jealous of her. So that's very hard. But I have a question, because I have a background in professionally, and I write, and I'm asking you, how did you separate your very complex, and use at the same time, use and separate your complex psychological history when you write fiction? I've personally struggled with that, and I look forward to hearing how you are negotiating that issue. Thank you.
It's an interesting question. How do I separate my emotional history from my fiction? And I would say it starts with sort of figuring out what my intention is. As I said earlier, it took me a while to figure out what I was trying to do with grown women. And when I figured it out after writing many, many versions of this and people responding to it, and like, it's just not there yet. And then suddenly I figured out I was trying to write myself into the future. And once I remember my agent at some point saying, fiction is not true to life. That's not why people read fiction. And I rejected that at first, but eventually accepted that the book should not be a memoir. It should not be autobiographical, because it would give me freedom narratively to write a different story, a more satisfying and I think coherent story. Because often like our arcs are not, perfect like a novel. So I think it's easier to let it be fiction.
I have a question. I really resonated with your story. So my question is, don't worry, I'm okay. I was abandoned. I'm fine. I was abandoned, so I had no mother or father due to a lot of circumstances in Johannesburg, South Africa. So when I finally grew up, went to the university, grew up, all that kind of thing, I had similar issues that you had. I won't go over those again. But at the end of the day, through writing, I tried to understand the no contact and understand it by flipping things around, making the horrific. What if it wasn't horrific? What if I dodged a bullet by being abandoned? Various kinds of ways like that. So my question is, ultimately, my solution was to not accept the no contact. And through the writing, I was able to establish contact. So I had a real physical mom, say for about 10 years of my adult life. And she recently died. So I really have no contact. It's over.
Right.
So I wondered if you had ever considered, which would be helpful to me, if you would consider writing a book about when no contact becomes no contact, becomes contact.
So I would say in grown women, that does happen.
I'll read it.
Yeah, I won't go too much into it, but there is a character that has been long no contact and reestablishes contact. And I would say it is not successful because of someone's inability to sort of move forward.
I feel so grateful now that it was successful, and I still have her. I had her ashes brought to Austin, and she's interred there, and I go talk to her many days. So that's why your book resonated with me. I knew you were in there with me. So I will definitely read your book, and I'm grateful that you wrote it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
First and foremost, thank you so much for sharing your story. Oh, your story and your journey. I'm good, outdone. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
As I listened to you, I couldn't help but wonder if Well, one of the things we're acutely aware of is that all women aren't necessarily made to be mothers. That's evident. But at any time, was there any consideration as you grew older, looking back, that maybe there was a hint of a mental illness? That's my first question. The second question is, how did your mother interact with the other children or your siblings? And then what was the perspective of your community, either your extended family and their perception of the relationship that you had with your mother?
The first question
that's
was...
That's loaded, I'm sorry.
Was there a mental illness? Probably. The second question was...
It may have been undiagnosed.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know.
Okay, and the second question is the interaction of your mother with the siblings, your
Okay.
siblings?
So I have 2 older brothers, and they struggle with her as well, but in different ways. Very, very different ways. As we've gotten older, I've had conversations with both of them in which they've said that she was after me. She targeted me. But maybe jealousy, I don't know. I think because as a woman, I represented something that did not happen for her, either in her childhood or in her future, in like a career she did not have. So I would say right now, probably all of my siblings are no contact with her. But.
And the last question had to be with, or had to deal with community and the perception of either extended family as well as friends and family about your relationship.
So growing up, there was a lot of like, she's your mom, this is typical, you're gonna have conflict with your mother. And I thought I was crazy. But I knew something was not quite right. And I stood my ground on that. And eventually, people like my oldest brother's wife for a long time was advocating for us to like reconcile. And recently, there were a series of incidents that she was like, I understand, I get it. So I think ultimately everyone, including my husband, we've come to a place where it's like, it's okay, it's okay.
Thank you.
Interviews?
In the years coming where your children are in their formative years, what relationship or contact do you feel is best with their grandmother?
I think none. My daughter, who is going to kindergarten soon, I see just so much like glitter and light and fabulousness in her, and I don't want anybody to dim that in any way, and I know my mother is capable of that. And I really do feel like if I can prevent her from experiencing some of what I experienced, then I will.
Thank you for sharing your story, because it really resonates with me and my birth mother. I have a stepmother that I'm close to, but my birth mother and my brother and sister and myself for like 40 years had no contact and did not let her see my children because I did not want the abuse. But at the end of her life, which was, she was 90, I did reconnect to help her, but the other 2 did not, the other 2 siblings. Mm-hmm. So it's hard, and life is complicated. I would love to have, my question, I'd love to have your reading list. If you could give that to the Women's Club, I would appreciate it.
Okay, I will.
This was so gripping and so vulnerable. I'm just very pleased to have been in the audience. My question is, if you could give mental health providers feedback on how to most effectively help the people who come through their office doors, any feedback?
I've been with my therapist since I was probably like 22.
Well, my other question was, how long had you been in therapy? Because it was very impressive.
I've been in therapy for a really, really long time. I really value my therapist because she's honest with me. She will say, I think you're that's silly. And I think what has been most effective is sort of the honesty. I don't think everyone is capable of receiving honesty in the same way. But I think making sure that you're speaking very plainly with patients.
Yeah, thank you very much.